It had an editor from the start. There was no beat snapping, so you had to be very accurate with how you're placing them. There was no timing mechanisms or anything.
Hello there! So, to celebrate Osu's 10th anniversary, some of its developers and community members held a panel at Anime Expo last month. It detailed who Peppy, the lead developer, was, how the game started back in 2007, and where it's headed now in 2017 with Osu Laser. There's a lot to potentially discuss about the panel, but what caught my attention was the excerpt from the start of this video, the brief description of the editor from 10 years ago. Of course, I'd heard the horror stories of the previous editor's limitations, but I hadn't heard much about the specifics like no beat snapping or no timing mechanisms before this event. It made me wonder, what's it really like to map with older versions of the editor? Was it really that bad? And could I make something half decent given modern day mapping knowledge? Conveniently, I had no trouble finding out. Peppy re-released a 2007 Osu client a few years ago, so within minutes, I was ready to give it a try. This minimalist song setup gave me a good idea about what I was getting myself into. It had a basic metadata section, a basic difficulty setting section, a basic hit sounding section, and nice. I could only assume the rest of the editor had just the bare essentials as well, so I chose to map something as simple as possible, an easy difficulty. Difficulty settings were mostly the same as those in the modern editor. Circle size, instead of ranging between 2 and 7, ranged between 0 and 10, and overall difficulty accounted for both OD and approach rate. Like they were a shared value, which is why all old maps have OD equal to AR. There's also this star rating estimation thing here based on difficulty settings, which, very misrepresentative of actual difficulty. Next came the timing tab, which was nearly identical to its modern version. The only notable thing here was the manual entry button. Usually this would open the timing panel, but because green lines didn't exist, manual entry was just a manual entry of timing. So much more simple. And finally, the Compose tab, the part that actually matters. By looking at this, I was able to fully form my first impressions of the 2007 editor. It was kind of cute. I mean, look at these little pieces of artwork. A toddler could have drawn each one, and adding to that the bare bones options and the what do I put here box, the old editor gave off a casual, sort of homely vibe. It wasn't at all professional, but it's not like it was putting on airs of professionality either. It felt like it was made for fun, so I thought I was gonna have a fun time trying to map with it. Key word there being thought. As soon as I actually started mapping, I learned just how frustrating this old editor was. First off, I couldn't navigate the timeline. In the modern editor, I scrolled to move between different timeline ticks, but in the old editor, doing that only switched between different object types. There were two alternatives I was forced to use instead, clicking in the big timeline at the bottom and pressing the arrow keys, both of which were a major pain. The big timeline in the modern editor is pretty nice. I can click, like, say here if I want to go over here. Really easy. In the old editor, however, I had to actually click and drag the white cursor thing to its destination. Clicking just anywhere doesn't work, so it's like a pointless extra step. As for the arrow keys, they just weren't responsive. Like, look, I'm gonna press the right arrow key 8 times in the 2017 editor. It moved 8 ticks. To be expected, right? Now we'll do the same in the 2007 editor. What? Some key inputs just never registered if I hit them too quickly because this editor expected me to hold keys rather than tap them. Not easy to do when I think about maneuvering the timeline in terms of click X amount to move X ticks and not hold Y seconds to move X ticks. Out of frustration, I ended up inefficiently tapping keys anyway. Tacked onto that was just how inconvenient the arrow keys were to actually press. I keep my right hand on the mouse and my left hand on the left side of the keyboard at all times while mapping. But the arrow keys forced me to move one hand off its usual position. That's disorienting on its own, yet because I was doing it so hastily too, I'd often hit the down arrow key accidentally, lowering playback rate by 10% and causing me to go insane from listening to slight distortions in the song. Placing objects was, unsurprisingly, just as frustrating as navigating the timeline. In the modern editor, I always have grid snap disabled, but in the old version of the editor, that option didn't exist. All objects were automatically attached to the grid, which I could have dealt with, but pressing Shift actually disabled grid snap. So, of course, I kept a finger on Shift every time I placed or adjusted objects. That doesn't sound too bad, but it really felt like I was physically disabled. One of my fingers was out of commission, so I had to manage keyboard shortcuts with other fingers, and I wasn't really used to that. I would have been better off if grid snap was required and I wasn't tempted to press Shift all the time. So, slight tangent, time distance equality is a must for designing easy difficulties. It's the thing that makes spacing and rhythm intuitive, you know what it is already. Distance snap is the tool in the editor that automatically handles time distance equality, so I honestly thought this wouldn't be a problem. There's a button called beat snap here, which looks pretty similar to distance snap in the modern editor. The circle button here is also labeled as normal, so I assumed it was just another weird name choice. Yet, it wasn't working. I didn't really get why, so I opened up the help menu and saw what it was actually for. Beat snap is used to snap objects in the timeline. Like, disabling it just means objects are unsnapped, defeating the point of timing a map in the first place. It's not like this is a big deal, but it just seems so weird given everything I know about mapping requires snapping to the timeline. Okay, well, no distance snap. I had to eyeball time distance equality. Even though the numbers in the top right indicating spacing between objects weren't here either, that wasn't a big deal. The main concern I had with object placements was instead simply handling sliders. Being called normal gives me the impression that circles were the main object type I should have been using, yet I didn't take the warning. I used almost entirely sliders throughout the map, which I wrongly thought had extremely limited options. I could make two different slider shapes, a straight line or garbage. There was no in between. Red anchors didn't exist, so I couldn't make any fancy sharp angles, and the only curves were, yeah, not even close to perfectly round angles formed by sliders in the modern editor. I debated with myself over using these weird curves to make the map a bit more interesting, but after seeing just how gross they were in every situation, I opted for only straight sliders. Problem with that, though, it's hard to reflect changes in the music when every slider is the same thing. All I could do was vary the angles at which sliders are pointed, and without rotation commands, that was a pretty inconvenient thing to do. Out of desperation, I ended up drawing a triangle, importing as my map's background, and arranging sliders according to its lines, just to have some organized visual variety. Was it silly? Yes, but what else could I really do? So, my impression after struggling and completing a map. The 2007 editor is a cutely designed torture device. It looks fun, but everything about it is a pain to manage, and I think I lost a few years off my life trying to use it for just an hour and a half. The map I made with it was honestly bad. Maybe it's rankable, but it's not at all interesting. In its defense, though, I wasn't using the old editor 100% correctly. I was trying to make a modern-styled map in a not-so-modern editor. A map mainly consisting of circles attached to a grid would have been a better choice. Plus, I was supposed to navigate the timeline by holding the arrow keys rather than tapping them repeatedly, and there was a slider curve type dropdown that I failed to find. That thing was pretty cool actually, so I was lucky to notice it when I tried using the 2008 editor. Yes, I wasn't done yet. Making a bad easy difficulty and ending it there would have been just way too depressing. I decided to try a few more editors and see what their differences were. To do that, I just made another really convenient search here. This Reddit user's package of old OSU clients had a version from 2008, along with ones from 2010, 2011, 2012, and 2013, most of which I would have gone looking for soon after. Somehow, I wasn't able to find a 2009 client though. That year is the biggest mapping mystery. But anyway, song setup and timing in the 2008 editor weren't anything special. The first added more options similar to modern song setup, and the second added a basic version of the timing panel, still, unfortunately, lacking green lines. None of that was of concern to me anymore though. After using the 2007 editor, doing just about anything in the 2008 editor was like heaven, and that's what I cared about. I could place objects freely and navigate the timeline with highly responsive scrolling. This was actually workable, so despite not allowing slider velocity changes or other fancy features, I decided to map an insane difficulty. And to do that, song choice was an important factor. I chose a song with only two main levels of intensity, the first 30 seconds being calm and the last minute being intense. I felt like that was the most I could easily express with the editor's limitations. I mapped the first section with mainly circles and the second with mainly sliders, easily hiding the stagnant slider velocity. Speaking of sliders, here was where I figured out how to use the slider curve type option that I should have noticed in the 2007 editor. The first option, linear, worked the same way as red anchors. These sliders could form sharp corners with straight lines between them, just with a gray anchor instead of a red one. The second, Catmull, was the garbage curve I mentioned earlier. Catmull sliders were made of curves that mostly bent around each anchor while being almost entirely flat between them. The last was what I should have been using on that 2007 map, Bezier. Or, well, it's a French word, so it's pronounced like Bezier. I don't really know. Bezier curves were the best way to form perfectly rounded sliders, so they were what most old mappers favored. And they were what I favored as well. The map I made in this editor uses linear sliders on each major downbeat and slightly curved Bezier sliders for everything else. Actually, because red anchors were added to this editor, I thought I wasn't even going to need to use a slider curve type thing. Linear sliders could be formed with the red anchors, and it's not like I was going to use Catmull sliders anyway, but depending on slider curve type, red anchors work in kind of unusual ways. Red anchors on linear type sliders were the same, of course, but Bezier sliders had a barely noticeable curve that moved in a kind of funky way when trying to adjust the position of the anchor. And Catmull sliders were... What should I have expected, really? So instead of using red anchors, I had to repeatedly switch between linear and Bezier slider curve types while mapping. Kind of annoying to click an option up here every few seconds, but that was nothing compared to navigating the 2007 editor at least. To get the full mapping experience this time, I also decided to give hit sounding a try, which didn't last long. Without green lines, hit sound volume and sample sets were non-adjustable, plus there were only 2 hit sounds to choose from, a whistle and a finish. That's limiting already, but I couldn't select individual heads or tails of sliders either, so all hit sounds were unnecessarily repeated. Can't win everything, but I think hit sounding was the only really bad thing on this map. Object placement wise, I think this map turned out pretty nice. It had no revolutionary concepts or design gimmicks, but it expressed the song and its variations in ways I could see a modern map doing. The 2008 editor is restrictive, but it's comfortable to use still. Not bad for being 9 years old. So, skipping over the mysterious 2009 editor, I then moved on to the 2010 editor, where I was satisfied in almost every way. Finally, after so long, I could create green lines. The old timing panel here was kind of hard to interpret at first since it wasn't laid out in a table, but it had the same information as the new editor. This timing point inherited settings from the one above it, as indicated by the arrow, and the 1 times BPM thing referred to slider velocity relative to the above BPM value. This would have been perfect if not for how much the editor restricted variation. I know there's this old outdated guideline on the ranking criteria saying a maximum of 3 slider velocities should be used, but I didn't realize that was all that was possible back in 2010. 0.5 times, 1 times, and 2 times were the only values I could select, so I had to make do with them. I think this limitation actually made mapping the 2010 editor more fun. I needed to think about new ways to represent a song with only 3 vastly different slider velocities. I couldn't do any slight or gradual changes between sections, so they ended up being really interesting, I think. I was also happy to finally have rotation commands. Before, all I could do was symmetrically flip or rotate objects by 90 degrees, but now I could use the universal rotate by X degrees command and form any shapes I desired. This is like my most used keyboard shortcut. What made me happiest about this editor, though, wasn't green lines or rotation. It was actually something I shouldn't be happy about. It was the addition of keyboard shortcuts to switch between different slider types. I felt like I could more easily experiment with different slider shapes now that I could switch between them so easily, which was why I ended up using these Catmull sliders for the entire Ki. They were ugly, no doubt, but they worked well to differentiate an important part of the song, so I think it was an alright choice. Plus, I think the wave sliders look kinda cool, right? Aside from that, though, not much else about this editor is really notable. I mean, we got big white ticks in the timeline, a clap hit sound, the ability to select heads and tails of sliders, and a bunch of other minor features, all of which are useful, but green lines, rotation, and slider type usage shortcuts were the big ones that made an impact on how I made this map. Which, by the way, turned out to be one of my best, and I think that's because of the editor. This version of it was actually fun to use, like even more than the modern editor. It made me think differently about representing a song with different slider velocity choices, and I now feel like there's more potential for Catmull sliders that I haven't delved into yet, so I might actually try making more maps with the 2010 editor sometime down the line. Unfortunately, the 2011 editor was where I started to grow disappointment. It has almost all the same features as a modern editor, like the newly designed timing panel, these numbers in the top right, and the object orientation shortcuts. Old, outdated features were now removed too, like the slider curve type option and slider velocity limitations. Every slider instead used a Bezier curve by default, and linear shapes could be formed with properly functioning red anchors. At the same time, green lines could be set to slider velocities anywhere between 0.5 times and 2 times, just as is available now. If you didn't recognize this slight imperfection of slider bodies, you'd think this map was made in the modern editor. Nothing about my mapping seemed really restricted in any way. The final product was just a map. Not a bad one, but not an interesting one, and I think that's the best way to describe this editor as well. It's not a pain to use by any means. Everything about it works perfectly. Unlike the 2007, 2008, and 2010 editors though, it didn't really interest me because it shared so many similarities to the modern editor. The 2007 editor, while causing me mostly frustration, was at least interesting to mess around with at first. Reaching the point where the old editors and the modern editor converged was inevitable, but I didn't expect it to happen so soon. The 2012 editor was where I stopped because there wasn't any real point in making a map in it. For the most part, this old editor was the same as the modern editor, packed with an unreadable skin. It introduced per object hit sounding and the new 3-point slider, which formed perfectly round curves in every situation. As far as I'm concerned, those have been the last major changes to the editor in the last 5 years. We've had some minor additions since then, like view options and higher distance snap choices, but none of those have changed the way mappers create maps to the degrees that per object hit sounding and 3-point slider curves have. So yeah, that's about where this journey ends. If you were curious about what it was like to map with older versions of the editor, or what major things have been added and changed over time, now you know. Well, you know some of it at least. Watching a video is way different from experiencing changes firsthand, so if you want to try out each version of the editor yourself, there's a link to that Reddit user's pack of clients in the description. And if anyone has a 2009 client, you should slip that my way. I need it. And most importantly, it should go without saying that I need a new version of the editor too. What I've been calling the modern editor is practically the same as the one from 5 years ago, meaning it lacks a ton of features that would make modern mapping techniques far easier to manage. Though, I might not need to worry about that much longer.
How many of you have mapped for us out there? Given it a try. Yeah?
I tried.
We're trying to make it more friendly going forward, so I hope a lot more people get into mapping because it's really fun to do.